You feel the weight of the gown before you see it. Silk and brocade, stiff as armor, crushing your ribs with every shallow breath. The bedchamber is vast and cold, despite the fire crackling in the stone hearth, and you can hear them outside the door. The witnesses, the priests, the courtiers who will not leave until they have proof. Your hands are shaking. You are 12 years old, and the man who now owns your body is a stranger whose wine-soaked breath you smelled for the first time only hours ago. This is not a celebration. This is a transaction, and you are the currency. Before we step further into these shadows, I'd be curious to know, where in the world are you listening from? It's extraordinary to me that we can share these forgotten stories across continents, connected by the same pull toward the hidden corners of history. The year is 1114, and in the frost-gripped Cathedral of Mainz, a girl named Matilda of England walks toward an altar she can barely see through the fog of incense and her own terror. She is the daughter of Henry the Horn, a king who sees kingdoms in her womb and alliances in her blood. Across from her stands Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor, a man of 28 winters, his face carved by war, his eyes empty of affection. The marriage was arranged when she was 7. She has spent the last 5 years in a foreign land, learning a foreign tongue, preparing for a role no child should know. And now, as the bells toll across the Rhine Valley and the Archbishop's voice drones through Latin she only half understands, the final lesson begins. Medieval wedding nights were not private affairs. They were political theater. The union had to be witnessed, verified, consummated under scrutiny to ensure legitimacy. The bed itself was blessed by priests. The linens inspected afterward for the stain that would prove her purity and his potency. In the flickering torchlight of the imperial palace, Matilda stands as servants strip the mattress bare, as women she has never met undress her with efficient, indifferent hands. The emperor enters. He does not speak to her. He does not need to. The door closes, but it is not locked. Beyond it, the court waits. What the chronicles do not record, what they never record, is the sound of her breathing, the way her body stiffened, the cold that seeped into her bones despite the furs piled on the bed. History remembers the alliance. It forgets the girl. Matilda was not alone in this. Across the medieval world, queens and noblewomen were married as children, their bodies offered up before they were ready, their worth measured only in the sons they might produce. But the fear they carried into those chambers was not just of pain. It was of failure, of barrenness, of dying in childbirth before ever seeing their 16th year, and beneath it all, a deeper, quieter terror, that no one would ever ask if they were afraid. 50 miles south of Matilda's wedding, in the sun-drenched vineyards of Aquitaine, another young woman prepared for her own reckoning. Eleanor was 15 when she married Louis VII of France in the summer of 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux. She was not a frightened child. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine, the wealthiest heiress in Europe, a woman who spoke 4 languages and rode her own horse. But wealth and power do not soften stone, and Louis, 17 and raised in a monastery, approached their wedding night with the hesitation of a man who had been taught that pleasure was sin. The bedding ceremony unfolded as it always did. The priests blessed the bed with holy water. The courtiers toasted with hippocras, a spiced wine so strong it burned the throat. Eleanor, dressed in a shift of fine linen, stood as attendants pulled back the heavy curtains of the canopied bed. Louis entered, pale and awkward, his hands trembling. He had been trained to rule, but not for this. Chronicles hint that he struggled, physically, emotionally, with the expectations of kingship. Eleanor, bold as she was, could not speak her own apprehension aloud, not with the court listening, not when her entire duchy depended on her producing an heir. For 15 years she tried. She bore him 2 daughters, Marie in 1145 and Alex in 1150, but no sons. And in a world where a queen's failure to produce male heirs was grounds for annulment, Eleanor's position grew more precarious with every passing year. Whispers followed her through the halls of the Parisian court. Rumors of affairs, of barrenness, of a marriage cursed by God. By 1152, the union was dissolved on the pretense of consanguinity. They were distant cousins, a fact conveniently ignored until it became useful. 8 weeks later, Eleanor married Henry II of England and bore him 8 children, 5 of them sons. The problem, it turned out, had never been hers. But the fear from that first night lingered. The fear that her body might betray her, that the pain and humiliation of the wedding chamber would be for nothing, that she might die trying to give them what they demanded. Not every medieval bride faced an unwilling or incompetent husband. Some faced something worse: indifference. Isabella of France was 12 years old when she married Edward II of England in January 1308, in a ceremony meant to heal decades of war between their two kingdoms. She crossed the Channel in the dead of winter, her ship battered by storms, and arrived at Boulogne-sur-Mer to a wedding that should have been a triumph. She was beautiful, intelligent, the daughter of the most powerful king in Europe. Edward was 23, handsome, charming when he wanted to be. The marriage should have been a fairy tale. It was not. At the wedding feast, Edward sat beside his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight he loved with a devotion that scandalized the court. He gave Gaveston gifts meant for his bride. He seated him in the place of honor. Isabella, dressed in silver tissue and pearls, sat at the far end of the table, ignored. Her uncles, the French princes who had accompanied her, seethed. But there was nothing they could do. The marriage had been sealed. That night, in a chamber warmed by braziers glowing with charcoal, the bedding ceremony proceeded. The curtains were drawn. The witnesses withdrew, but not far. Edward entered, and Isabella, for all her royal training, felt the floor tilt beneath her, because the man who touched her that night was not thinking of her. His mind was elsewhere. His heart belonged to someone else, and she knew it. The marriage was consummated technically. She bore him 4 children over the next decade, but the wound from that first night never healed. By 1325, sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty, Isabella refused to return to England. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer, and invaded her husband's kingdom. Edward II was deposed, imprisoned, and murdered in Berkeley Castle in 1327, in a manner so brutal that chroniclers whispered of red-hot pokers and screams that echoed through the night. Isabella ruled as regent until her son came of age, and then she was exiled to a quiet estate in Norfolk, where she lived out her final 30 years in silk and solitude. But it all began in that chamber in Boulogne, with a girl who realized, on her wedding night, that she had been traded for a treaty and married to a man who would never love her. The darkest stories, though, are the ones history tried hardest to bury. Margaret Beaufort was 12 years old when she was married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, in November 1455. She was an heiress, a descendant of kings through the legitimized Beaufort line, and her body was a vessel for dynastic ambition. Edmund was 24, a soldier loyal to the Lancastrian cause, and he needed an heir. Quickly. The wedding took place at her manor in Lamphy, Pembrokeshire, a modest ceremony in a land gripped by civil war. That night, in a chamber lit by rushlights and warmed by a fire that did little to chase away the Welsh cold, Edmund consummated the marriage. Margaret's body was not ready. Physicians of the era understood that girls her age risked catastrophic injury in childbirth, but political necessity outweighed medical caution. By early 1456, she was pregnant. By November, Edmund was dead of plague, and Margaret was alone, 13 years old, carrying a child in a castle surrounded by enemies. She went into labor on January 28, 1457, at Pembroke Castle. The labor lasted hours. Some accounts say a full day. Her pelvis was too narrow, her body too small. She hemorrhaged, she screamed, and when it was over, when the baby, a boy, Henry, finally emerged, Margaret was told she would never bear another child. The damage was permanent. Henry Tudor would grow up to become Henry VII. the founder of the Tudor dynasty. But his mother paid the price. For the rest of her life, Margaret walked with pain. She remarried twice for protection and alliance, but never had another pregnancy. She poured her grief into piety and politics, founding colleges, manipulating courts, engineering her son's rise to the throne. But the trauma of that wedding night, of being used, broken, and discarded by a system that saw her only as a womb, never left her. She died in 1509, days after watching her son's funeral. In her private papers, she left prayers asking God's forgiveness for sins she never named. Historians believe she carried guilt for surviving when so many girls like her did not, because for every Matilda, every Eleanor, every Isabella who lived long enough to be remembered, there were a dozen more who died in childbed before their 16th birthday. Girls whose names were scratched out of family trees, whose graves bore no markers, whose fear was swallowed by the silence of history. The chronicles recorded treaties and battles. They noted which queen bore which prince, but they did not record the trembling hands, the stifled sobs, the nights when a child bride lay awake beside a stranger and prayed for dawn. They did not record the women who whispered warnings to their daughters, knowing those warnings would not be heeded. They did not record the quiet, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the next generation would do better. They rarely did. In the archives of the British Library, there is a letter written by an anonymous noblewoman in the late 13th century, discovered tucked inside a book of hours. It is addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. It reads, in part, "They say we are blessed to marry kings. They say our duty is holy, but no one speaks of the cold, of the fear, of the smallness you feel when your body is no longer yours. I pray my daughter is spared this. I pray she is strong enough to survive what I could not say no to." The letter was never sent. It was never meant to be. Medieval queens feared their wedding nights not because they were weak, but because they understood, better than anyone, the cost of power. Their bodies were the battlegrounds on which empires were built. Their pain was the price of peace, and their silence was the only rebellion they were allowed. The stone floors of those ancient castles are still cold. The tapestries still hang, dusty and heavy in the halls where these women walked. And if you listen closely, in the spaces between the chronicler's confident prose, you can almost hear the echo of what they could not say.